Now that we've looked at a lot of the organ structures in the head and neck pertaining to digestion and the respiratory system, let's look further down at some of the digestive organs. So as a quick recap, let's look at some of the structures in the head again. We've got the gingiva, the gums, the teeth, and we've got the parotid salivary gland here, which if the masseter were still in view, you'd see the masseter here. Remember, the masseter pretty much covers the ramus of the mandible. And we have got the parotid salivary gland here. And then if we look through the mandible, which we can see we've got several other salivary glands. We've got the submandibular gland here. We've got the sublingual gland here. There's one on both sides. And then we can also see that we've got a little bit of the larynx here. The larynx is here, but we don't have the trachea. The trachea has been cut away so that we can see the esophagus. And the esophagus is the passageway from the mouth to the stomach. And as it passes through the diaphragm, remember the diaphragm is that sheet of muscle that separates the thoracic cavities from the abdominal cavity, the abdominopelvic cavity. And that's this blue sheet here, what I've identified as blue. The esophagus goes through the diaphragm at what we call the esophageal hiatus. And the esophageal hiatus is basically this little hole through which the esophagus comes through and enters into the abdominal cavity. Now, the esophagus joins the stomach via this esophageal sphincter, what we call the gastroesophageal sphincter. And that is a little band of muscle that regulates food coming from the mouth down the esophagus into the stomach. And it also prevents, or hopefully prevents, backflow of materials from the stomach into the esophagus. Now remember that the stomach contents are often quite acidic. And so what we don't want is acid reflux or stomach contents regurgitating back into the esophagus, because that can cause, over time, that can damage the esophagus. And it's commonly known as acid reflux. So let's look at the stomach now in a little bit more detail. So here's the diaphragm. Once again, we're actually going to hide that now. And now we can see the stomach, and we can see that the stomach has parts of it cut away so that we can see the different layers of the stomach. But before we get into the different layers of the stomach, let's talk about the different parts. So we have this part right here, where the esophagus enters into it. This area right next to that is called the cardiac portion, sometimes just the cardia. And we see that it is right next to the heart. And I've left some of the heart structures here so that you can get an idea of where the heart is. So here you see your atrioventricular valves, your semilunar valves here. You can see your aorta here. You can see a bit of the conducting system of the heart and some of the vasculature. But basically, I just want to give you an idea of where the heart sits. And so that this part of the stomach is called the cardiac portion, or the cardia. Then we have the fundus of the stomach, which is this rounded part right here. So the rounded part of the stomach is called the fundus. Then we have the body of the stomach, which is this main part right here. And then from there we have the pyloric portion of the stomach. And the pyloric portion of the stomach will basically join the duodenum, or the first part of the small intestine. This is the duodenum, the beginning of it. It will join the duodenum via the pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter is basically what regulates the emptying of the stomach contents into the duodenum. And you can also say duodenum, either way, duodenum, duodenum, duodenum. There are many ways to pronounce it. So you can see inside this passageway, and this passageway is going to be regulated by the pyloric sphincter. And notice that we have this sort of constriction here, right where the stomach ends and the duodenum begins. So let's talk a little bit about the stomach. We've already seen the layers of smooth muscle in the stomach. We have the outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle in the stomach, and then we have the middle circumferential layer of smooth muscle in the stomach. The stomach also has an additional oblique layer, and that is going to be the internal layer. And this is all going to help with gastric motility and moving contents of the stomach around. So then we have the mucosa of the stomach, and that's going to be there. And we can see that when we look at the mucosa, it's all on the inside too. So we've got the mucosa, and this actually just identifies all the contents, or all the parts of the stomach, I should say, the layers. But the mucosa is this inner lining here. And what we will see is when we zoom in on it, we will see that it's got all of these folds in it. And the folds are called rugae. And the rugae allow for the distension of the stomach, so as you put more food in it, it can expand. Now, owing to the shape of the stomach, we have got two curvatures. We have got what is called the greater curvature, which is the outside curvature of the stomach, and we have the lesser curvature. And the lesser curvature is the inside curvature of the stomach. Now, attached to the outer curve of the stomach, the greater curvature of the stomach, we have something called the greater omentum. And this is a fatty sort of apron that hangs over the intestines. So this is the greater omentum, and basically it is going to hang from the greater curvature of the stomach, and it is going to cover these intestines here. So if we fade it a little bit, you can see sort of how it kind of interdigitates around the curves of the small intestine and folds around the large intestine here. So that is the greater omentum. We used to call it the cheese skirt when we dissected it in the cats, because you could pull it out and it looked like a giant cheesy apron. We also have, attached to the inner curvature of the stomach, we have something called the lesser omentum, and you can see it here, and that's this fatty tissue here. And this is also going to be sort of a route for blood vessels between the stomach and the liver here. Now, one of the other things I want to do is show a little bit more about the liver. So as we've seen, we looked at the stomach a little bit earlier. We've seen the greater and the lesser omentum. Now let's look at the left lobe of the liver. So the left lobe of the liver is going to be this half, and the right lobe of the liver is going to be the larger part that we can see from the outside. Another thing that we will see, and now I'm going to get rid and hide some of these rib structures here. So if I get rid of these, we can see the liver a little bit better, and we can see some of the underlying organs here. So very quickly, I'm going to remove this. And now we can see the liver. And we can see, basically, we have got our left lobe and we've got our right lobe. In between, we have the falciform ligament. And the falciform ligament is really going to hold the liver to the diaphragm. So it really helps stabilize the position of the liver. We can see the gallbladder here. We'll look at that in more detail in just a little bit. But I wanted to show, while we had a picture of the liver in its entirety here, intact, we could look at some of the liver here and see basically what we see from the outside. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to where we were, and now we can see sort of a dissected view of the liver. And we can see that the left part of the liver has been cut away, so the left lobe is not in this view. The right lobe is. We can also see a part of the liver called the caudate lobe, and that is posterior, and you can see it here as we have cut away part of the right lobe of the liver. You can also see, and the left lobe of the liver is not here in the picture anymore. Here we can see the gallbladder, and one of the things I wanted to show you was a series of ducts. So we have what is called the common hepatic duct right here. And if the liver were intact, you would just be able to see the common hepatic duct. But it is going to be a mergence of the left and right bile ducts, left and right hepatic ducts from the liver. So we've got the left hepatic duct and the right hepatic duct, and they will merge to form this common hepatic duct. Now, as we know, the liver produces bile, but that bile is concentrated within the gallbladder. So it gets in there via the cystic duct. And the cystic duct is that duct that leads from basically the hepatic duct, the common hepatic duct, into the gallbladder. So this is the cystic duct. And then we have the common bile duct. And the common bile duct is where we have the cystic duct and the common hepatic duct fuse. So these are some important ducts that we will see associated with the liver and the gallbladder. And we can also see here a little bit of the pancreas and the spleen. So I want to show you the spleen here. And the spleen is going to be on the left side of the body. So here is our spleen. And it's right over next to the stomach. And then we have the pancreas. And the pancreas is fairly well hidden by the stomach right now, but here's the stomach, here is the body of the pancreas, here's the tail of the pancreas. And if I move this down a little bit, we can sort of move this around to where we might be able to see the head of the pancreas. So the head of the pancreas is down there. So in order to see the pancreas, let's hide the stomach. So now we can see the pancreas in its entirety. Here is the entire pancreas. The head of the pancreas, the body of the pancreas, and the tail of the pancreas. And you can see sort of the outline of where the stomach was. And you can also see that the pancreas is also going to empty into the duodenum, which is this first part of the small intestine. So we have the common bile duct, and we're going to have the pancreatic duct. We could probably look inside the pancreas here, and we could see the pancreatic duct in there. So I'm going to basically hide some of these parts of the pancreas. Here you can see the pancreatic duct. And this is going to empty into the duodenum, and you can see, if I were to remove this, you can see it through it. The transverse colon here, you can see where the common bile duct and the pancreatic duct are going to empty into the duodenum, which is that first part of the small intestine. And the duodenum basically is going to be, this is the end of the duodenum is really, well, right here. And then that's going to lead right into the jejunum. And the jejunum is the next part of the small intestine. So the duodenum is this very short piece from here to here. And in order to click on it, I really have to get under the transverse colon. So there's the duodenum there. And then the duodenum is going to empty right into the jejunum, which is the next part of the small intestine. And in the human, it's actually a little bit different from in the cat. If you're familiar with the cat has a very large jejunum, and the ileum is not that large in cat. But in human, the ileum is quite long, and that's the third segment of the small intestine. And the ileum is basically going to empty into the first part of the large intestine called the cecum. And that's this part right here. So we can see the cecum, and it has its appendix that's attached to it. So this is sometimes called the vermiform appendix because of its resemblance to a worm. So here's the cecum, and here's our vermiform appendix. So now let's fade the cecum here so we can sort of see through it. And now let's zoom in on a little bit, and I want to show you the ileocecal sphincter. Now we can start to see it come into view here. So you see where the ileum empties right into the cecum. And remember, I faded the cecum a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is hide the cecum. So you can see this ileocecal sphincter. This would be this part that empties right into the cecum. And that is going to be coming right from the ileum. Here we have our ileocecal sphincter, which we can see a little bit. I'll draw a circle around it. This is the ileocecal sphincter as it empties into the cecum. Now from here, what we can do is we can look at sort of the rest of the large intestine. And as you remember, the large intestine has these pouches called haustra, and we have the tenei colii, which are those strips of smooth muscle that are the longitudinal strips that are specific to the large intestine. So I just wanted to point those out since we can see them. And then what I thought I'd do is just zoom out a little bit and go over some of the large intestine. So let's look at the ascending colon here, which is the part that's going to ascend, not surprisingly. Then we have the transverse colon here. Then we have the descending colon over here. Remember, the large intestine is framing the small intestine. So here's our descending colon. That's going to give way to the sigmoid colon, so-called because it has sort of a sharp S-shaped curve here. And that's going to give rise to the rectum. So the rectum is the very end of this thing. And at the end of the rectum, there is the anal canal. So once again, we have the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum. So those are the parts of the large intestine that you need to see. Now we can unhide or unfade these things so that you can see the large intestine a little bit better. So I'm going to identify all of the large intestine so that we can see it and how it frames the small intestine. So here is the large intestine in its entirety. Once again, the cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and rectum. Now in this view, what I'm going to do is go quickly over the sphincters once again. So we have the gastroesophageal sphincter, which is really right here. We have the pyloric sphincter, which is right here, and they've cut away part of it so you can see inside. And we also have the ileocecal sphincter, which you can see is right there. And you can see it sort of through the cecum here. I had to fade the cecum so you can see it. But those are the sphincters that you need to know about for the digestive system. Now let's revisit the liver very quickly. So we've got two major lobes of the liver you can see from the front in the human. We have the left lobe, which is all of this, and we have the right lobe, which is all of this. So when you look at your sheet, which references cat liver lobes, the cat liver lobes have a left and right lateral and a left and right medial. In the human, we just have a left and a right lobe. Now, these are subdivided into basically segments, but you don't need to know the segments. We're not going to have you memorize the segments of the liver. Just suffice it to say that we've got the right lobe and we've got the left lobe. They're separated by the falciform ligament, which helps stabilize the position of the liver. Now, if we look on the back side, we can see two more lobes. We can see the caudate lobe right here. And you can remember it because it has this sort of part that sticks out in the back. And then we have one called the quadrate lobe. And you can see that on the inferior aspect here. So this is going to include the quadrate lobe. Here they don't really show the quadrate lobe by itself in this view. So they just show it as part of some of the other segments. But typically the quadrate lobe is going to be on the undersurface of the liver and is going to be anterior to the caudate lobe and on the undersurface of the liver. You can remember where it is because we have got our common hepatic duct and our cystic duct here that are going to be underneath it, and then we'll see our common bile duct here. So those are the lobes of the liver that we need to know. And obviously I have removed the pancreas. You can see the pancreatic duct here. Remember, we're looking from the posterior view. And we're looking at the posterior view of the liver. You can see the gallbladder under here. This is a nice view. You can see where the pancreatic duct and the common bile duct will empty into that duodenum at the duodenal papilla. So it's just another nice view. And here we can see from the posterior aspect, we can see the duodenum leading into the jejunum. We can also see very nicely the pyloric sphincter, which is going to be right here. So I just thought I'd point that out. So that pretty much concludes our liver. Now let's have a look at one last item in the digestive organ systems and structures. And what we're going to talk about is the mesenteries. And the mesentery is a double layer sheet of peritoneum where it's folded back on itself. And it's captured inside all of these blood vessels and lymphatics. And while Visible Body, our dissection software and Atlas software here, doesn't really show the mesenteries themselves, it does show the vasculature of the intestines. So here we have our superior mesenteric artery, and you can see it giving rise to all of these branches. And of course, we've sort of faded the small intestine here so you can see through it and what that would look like. And so what I'm going to do is show the cat mesentery here. As if you were to take the small intestine and spread it open, you would see how the blood vasculature is distributed through this clear membrane, which is a double sheet of peritoneum that has these vasculature and lymphatic vessels in it. And so that would be the mesenteries.